Hello, welcome to Burley Fisher Books, or at least the version of it that exists in my spare room, surrounded by my laundry. Thank you for joining us this evening for the launch of Radical Attention by the brilliant Julia Bell, published by Peninsula Press. So I'm just going to run through the agenda for the event. So to start us off, Julia's going to give us a reading, and then Julia will be in conversation with Olivia Laing, and then at the end we'll be taking questions from the audience, which you can ask in the comments on the side of the video, as and when they occur to you, and we'll be keeping track of them, and at the end we'll put them to Julia and to Olivia. So, Radical Attention is a book about connection, and largely about getting away from screens and the importance of being in the room with one another and paying attention to one another. So it seems very strange to be launching it in this way, sat in front of our screens apart from one another. But I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to do that. And I just wanted to start off putting my Peninsula hat on by thanking Julia for writing this book, which I think seems more and more prescient with each passing day. It was supposed to come out just before lockdown, and we worked on it as events started to overtake all of the structures that Julia was trying to describe, and it coming out this week, or being available from last week on the eve of the American election, has felt, I don't know, a great tonic to everything that's been happening. So I want to thank Julia on behalf of the press and on behalf especially of Jake, who edited the book. I'm the show pony, so I'm here. My Burley Fisher hat on introducing, but he has been vital to editing this book, so he wants to express his thanks to Julia as well. I also wanted to give an introduction to Olivia Laing, who needs no introduction, but is going to get one anyway. Olivia Laing is the author of To the River, The Trip to Echo Spring, The Lonely City, and a novel Crudo. Her collected essays, Funny Weather, Art in an Emergency, are out now. And Olivia has a new book coming out called Everybody, which is a book about freedom, in early next spring. So please look out for that. Order Olivia's brilliant books, and I want to say thank you to Olivia for coming along to speak to Julia today. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Julia to give us a reading from the very brilliant Radical Attention.
Hi, so hello, welcome to my kitchen. I just want to start, before I do a very short reading from this book, with a couple of really big thank yous to Peninsula Press, to Sam and to Jake and to Will for having the vision to run a small press in these difficult times, and for also commissioning me to write this piece, which has been a really interesting journey. And particularly big thanks to Jake for all of the hard work that we did kind of editing this. I'm so pleased now it's published that I can't find yet any mistakes in it. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to read a very short bit from the beginning, because it seems like a better place to start. San Francisco. A man pulls out a pistol on a crowded train. On the CCTV footage of that afternoon, he clearly waves the gun around, points it across the aisle several times. His fellow passengers are only feet away, but no one notices him. They're all staring, scrolling, texting. The man is in the grip of some kind of mania, clearly a danger to himself and other people. Jeopardy, chaos, terror are right there, but no one is paying attention. Not until he fires the gun into the back of the head of a disembarking passenger, killing 20-year-old student Justin Valdez, does anyone notice. The early 1990s, Birmingham. I log on to my friend's CompuServe on a brand new Mac with a bright coloured screen. I enter a chat room. Hello, I type into the machine. A beat's pause. Hello is typed back. I remember I screamed. I'm sitting in the park local to my London home. I've gone out for a walk, deliberately left my phone and wallet behind to clear my head a little after a busy day in front of the screen. I feel dazed and dopey, my mind a blur of ideas and images. The last hour of my work time has been spent in a black hole scrolling through web pages and social media accounts looking for what? By the time I came up for air, a stiff neck, pressing need to pee, I'd forgotten what I'd been searching for in the first place. I was clicking uselessly into a void, pages and pages of information, none of which I was even reading, pinging between social media accounts, searches, email, my phone and laptop screens. I'd been writing, but barely got through a paragraph. It never used to be like this when I sat down to write. I could manage 3 or 4 hours in a sitting with a few lapses, maybe just a short pause, a 5-minute break. Time was a continuum of attention, a satisfying thread of productivity that left me feeling as if I'd achieved something, not just dazedly lost myself somewhere, zombified by the machine. Shaking myself awake, I watch the wind stir the leaves that are curling out towards summer. I feel drugged. It's cloudy, cool but not cold. The view is pedestrian, a scruffy urban park, a row of plane trees. I become aware of the people in the park around me, everyone apart from an old couple talking quietly to each other, and the children playing on the swings. Scrolling, texting, next bench. Everyone is on their phones, scrolling, texting, next bench, shoulders hunched. My neighbours in the meat space, but no longer of this late spring day. A line runs through my head in an American accent. For your comfort and security, keep your eyes on the scenery and not on the screen. A public safety announcement I heard repeatedly on the San Francisco Muni the last time I was there. Every journey punctuated by this phrase, followed by the hiss of brakes and the clatter of the closing doors. I am overwhelmed by a sense of purposelessness, as if I'm waiting for something to happen, but I don't know what. I'm aware that it's the traces, the marks on my psyche that being constantly looped into a reward cycle has left behind. It's like I've forgotten how to be. Looking at my fellow citizens who can't even see me, I also feel weirdly lonely. I regularly bump into people on the street who are staring at their phones. Smombies is the German word, smartphone zombies. Friends have their phones grabbed out of their hands on the street. Students firing up their phones after class are targeted by men on mopeds. Warning signs appear at tube stations. There is a Wikipedia page which keeps a tally of all the people who've died while taking selfies. Falling from a beauty spot or in front of a moving train, distracted while driving or swept off a sea wall in rough weather, or electrocuted by rail tracks or shot by mistake. It makes for gruesome reading. Perhaps it could be cruelly funny, until you start to notice the age of those who died: 14, 17, 18, 15, 20, 16, 19, 21. A litany of tragicomic death that reads almost like Edward Gorey's The Gashly Crumb Tinies. A is for Amy, who fell down the stairs. B is for Basil, assaulted by bears. It's the stuff of Gothic B-movies, a warning we can't take seriously. For your comfort and security, keep your eyes on the scenery and not on the screen. A few weeks after I sat in the park, Google sent me a timeline to remind me where I'd been through the month. Berlin, London, Tempelhof, King's Cross, my office, my home, the houses of my friends. It told me how often I'd visited these places. I was surprised by this email, unaware that I'd signed up for it through some overlooked checkbox on a page I hadn't read properly. The one omission was the park, where I'd been without my phone. I thought of that afternoon, the familiar and yet strange sight of everyone lost in their screens, the curl of wind in the leaves on the plane trees, the silence of sudden solitude. Somehow this omission was the most important part of the data set and the most vivid memory I had of the whole month. Unencumbered by the screen, I was actually just able to be present with myself. This was the only moment when no one else had any idea at all of where I was, where Google couldn't know where I'd been. The more I thought about it, the more comforting that realization became. We are attention seekers by nature. From the moment we're born, we need to connect with others. We know from the work of Winnicott and others that part of healthy cognitive development involves being given enough attention by our primary caregivers. Regulation of our need for reassurance is part of achieving maturity. If we want to torture people, we put them in solitary confinement. Giving people the silent treatment is a classic form of bullying. In a very primal sense, our bodies need to know that they are noticed by other human bodies, if for nothing else than to be reassured that we exist. As Hannah Arendt notes, the presence of others who see what we see and hear what we hear assures us of the reality of the world and of ourselves. We are social creatures. born into vital interrelation to other humans. The internet offers us unprecedented new ways to connect to each other. How come then, in the midst of this frenzy of connection, we're facing an epidemic of loneliness? Thank you. I'll leave it there. You can read the rest in the book. And you can ask me some questions if you have any.
Hello. Hi. I am Olivia Laing. I'm very happy to be here. Julia and I have never met, but I became an enormous fan after reading her essay about Berghain, which I thought was extraordinary. And I first read this book, I suppose, before the lockdown, and then reread it this week during election mania. Sorry, my dog's behind me, which makes it look like I'm in strange shape. And it was so fascinating to read it in this state of being back in, locked to the news cycle, trying to consume as much information as possible and feeling fairly sickened by the process. So the thing I want to start with is that sense of what the source of the addiction is, what is actually happening to us when we're in that cycle with the internet. So you, in the little reading you just did, you used the phrase the reward cycle. And I wanted to ask, first of all, what do you mean by the reward cycle, and especially what do you mean by trained by the software?
I suppose I mean that it gives us a little hit of dopamine when we find something that we're interested in, and the internet, the algorithms are set in a certain way to keep giving us more of the things that we're interested in. So if we're interested in, and this I think leads to certain kinds of behaviors like hate scrolling and doom scrolling, where we keep being fed more and more information about the same thing, and we keep looking for an answer. We're anxious about something. We go to the internet because we have a feeling. And I've noticed really particularly that I pick it up when I'm bored or anxious, particularly when I'm anxious, because I think somehow it's going to absolve me of that anxiety. But what it actually does is heighten it in some really weird and interesting way. And I think that the software has trained us to respond, or the machine itself, the notifications on the phone. So the actual platform with which we use these social media platforms is deliberately training us to respond to those notifications. So straight away we've been trained, the thing goes ping, we look at the notification. So that's a kind of training. And then after that, there's just this enormous amount of information that we've got to parse. And it becomes incredibly, I think it just creates this incredible situation of anxiety where we keep thinking, I'm going to find the answer in a minute. I'm going to find the answer in a minute. Donald Trump's going to go away. I know that everything's going to be all right. Climate change is going to stop. And we get stuck into this. I can feel it in myself, and I can also see it in other people, that they somehow, that they get bored or anxious in a conversation and they pick up their phone and they start scrolling. And it's become almost an instinctive response. And I kind of feel sometimes in social situations that it's almost a direct embodiment of their anxiety, of their social anxiety. It's become okay for people to pick up a phone even in the middle of a conversation with somebody and to just be scrolling and paying attention to the conversation. Whereas what I feel is that they're kind of having an emotional reaction in some way to the conversation. They're bored or they're anxious or they're feeling socially anxious. And instead of that being part of the experience of being with each other, there's a way in which you can sort of pacify that feeling right there on the phone. And I think teachers are noticing that in schools, et cetera, et cetera. At the
same time, I think you make a very strong case that the machine is also generating those feelings, and especially that we're being watched by the machine. So there's a lovely anecdote part of the way through where you're in San Francisco and you meet a data miner for the first time. You know, what kind of miner is a data miner? And that sense, now we're so familiar with the idea that we're leaving this sort of snail trail of information behind us, but we're not quite sure what we've left or who can see it. I wanted you to talk a bit about what effect it has of our private lives being perpetually on display, perpetually available for other people who we may not know to read.
I think there are several things that happen. I think the political issue is that suddenly we are forced to become incredibly public as human beings. So everything we do is on display. Well, a lot of the politicians become very difficult to access. So politics becomes incredibly private and we become very public. And that's a flip to what I think we need in order to have a good democratic process is that the people who are in charge of things need to be answerable to us, and we need to have private spaces and protected private spaces in which we can be free. So I think that is one of the ways in which it's shifting the kind of political environment. But I also think this is very specific to me and my world of work and the book Twitter, I think particularly, which is that we're all expected to be selling the latest hot take about something. We all have to be out there, and that includes me. I mean, I'm there telling people that I've got this book out, that I have a launch, I'm waving around my opinions, and I become some kind of avatar for myself in this weird new world. I'm suddenly expected to sort of become a persona on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. And I'm quite aware of that being quite a dangerous place to be, because it's kind of unreal, and it's not actually meeting people in real life. It's not actually talking to people. It's not sitting with people. It's not listening to people. It's kind of consuming people. And it's also me expected to create a persona out of myself and sell myself, sell my ideas, sell my personality. And that's a real shift from, publishing books and newspaper articles and so on, which, even in 10 years, that's really changed. And I feel that pressure in my students. I feel it in some of the young people that I've met who I've been talking to about this book. They feel that pressure really intensely, that they have to come up with the latest hot takes. They have to sell their ideas. And in fact, you mentioned something in one of your essays in Funny Weather, where somebody says, oh, journalism's dying and we're not rich enough to choose morals over the need to survive. And you said, oh, well, morals are a luxury for the super rich. And I sort of think, well, yeah, they kind of are. We're in this place. Yeah,
the person I was annoyed with. Oh, yeah.
You're annoyed with them because they see, that whatever, they're just going to say anything for money. And I think we're seeing that a lot at the moment with what's going on around Donald Trump. Yeah. There's a huge amount of deliberate misinformation, a huge amount of deliberate, we can only have morals if we can afford to have them. I need to make a living. I need to have some,
I want to get more into the idea of what's happening, particularly to the public realm. But first of all, it just strikes me that there was a lovely line from William Gibson that you quote about the bodyless exaltation of cyberspace. And I just want to touch briefly on what you might have thought the internet was at the beginning of your relationship with the internet, because I think the internet has changed very rapidly over the last, let's say, 5 years. Yeah. And it's become much more of a toxic force in our culture, in our society, in our politics, but that wasn't what it always was. So what was the nature of your initial internet life?
I loved it. I thought it was the best thing ever. I was a really early adopter. I was shouting about it to all the skeptics. You've got to get into this. It's great, because I think it allowed people who hadn't had a voice to speak. I think it allowed publishing to suddenly become something that was cheap. It was really difficult and expensive to publish books. I think we forget how expensive it was to do a print run. We can now put stuff online in a second. We can platform people. We can record videos. All of that stuff's amazing. We can share. We can share all of the things that we're interested in. We can find out about new artists. I researched a lot of this book on the internet. I'm interested in just the sheer volume of information. But I think that the issue for me is that in the last 5 years, particularly, the way in which it's become monopolized, so it's being run by 5 or 6 very big monopolistic companies out of Silicon Valley, and the way it's being run for profit, and we are the product, our information, all of the stuff that we do online is being studied, and it creates a huge, great database of information which can be used to further sort of trail us around the internet, and it's putting us into silos of our interests. So it's withholding information from us too. I think we're not getting the whole picture. We're not getting the whole story. And we're certainly not speaking to each other. We're not speaking to people who hold very different views. And those views have become, I think, increasingly more entrenched. And I think that's becoming more and more of a problem. So it went bad. It started off being something I was really excited about. I thought it was a utopian space in a way, and I guess I'm disappointed that it's not, but that's my naivety. Maybe.
One of the things I was particularly struck by, I mean, this is material that's sort of read before, but I think you handled it very succinctly, is the idea that the algorithm isn't neutral. So somebody like Dominic Cummings might talk about is this sort of mathematical driven model that gives us a pure way of dealing with data. But of course, the algorithm isn't neutral. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that.
Well, I think when I was doing a lot of doing research for this book, it became really clear that people are very concerned about the way in which AI particularly is programmed and the way in which algorithms are written by a very sort of narrow group of not very diverse people. So they're building a system which bakes into it pre-existing prejudice. I mean, very clear example of software that couldn't recognize black faces because it hadn't been programmed to recognize them, because whoever designed the software just thought everybody had a white face. I mean, you know, from very sort of obvious mistakes like that to things where there really isn't any kind of understanding. I think one of my students works for DeepMind, and he's now studying an algorithm that he wrote that is a handwriting recognition software, but he doesn't quite know how it works. He's able to study how the algorithm identifies words by concentrating particularly on ing words at the end of a word, and how the algorithm will concentrate its attention on certain parts of words in order to recognize them, but he's not sure how it does it. So there's a sort of retroactive studying of the algorithm that he wrote, and I sort of feel, I think we need to have some kind of conversations about these things. They're being written and they're being deployed, and they have quite clear effects on the way in which we read things, the kinds of things that we're shown, the kinds of things we read. I think there are lots of examples, particularly of algorithms on Facebook, that shift the kinds of things that we see. And they're done behind closed doors. We have no idea who's deploying these, why they're deploying them, very secretively done. And more and more, I get a sense that I'm not actually seeing the real world. I'm seeing a world that's being constructed with profit at its center. But I'm also worried that because of that, it doesn't matter if it's a suicide note or a picture of your cat, as long as you're clicking on it.
Yeah. And then I think this is probably a good place to bring in the role of hatred, the sort of drumming up of hatred and outrage that's happened on the internet, again, in this sort of fairly narrow period in which we've seen dramatic changes happen in our politics in England, in Europe, and especially in America.
Yeah.
Can we talk about hatred now?
I think we're very anxious, and I think we try to go onto the internet to absolve our anxiety, but all I think it does is make it worse in lots of ways, because it keeps feeding us. It knows. I think that one of the things when I was doing the research, and Nir Eyal's book about Hooked, about how to design, you know, products that will keep people hooked, speaks quite nakedly about negative feelings being an incredible driver of traffic to the internet. So if you're feeling unhappy or bored or depressed or angry, you're going to go on the internet to find the echo chamber that will reflect best your feelings. And the knowledge that they have about you on some of those platforms is really very precise. And that information that you're looking for, you will find, and it will keep feeding you more and more of these sort of weird conspiracy theories to satisfy your feelings of anxiety, because you're clicking on them. So it becomes this kind of weird hamster wheel of information. How do we get off it? How do we get people off it?
And the end result of it is QAnon. That's where you go with it. And more people, you can see just over the last 6 months, more and more people falling into those sort of addictive rabbit holes. What is happening while our eyes are locked on the screen? What do you think is going on that we should be worried about?
I think we need to be worried about climate change. I think we need to be worried about our connections to each other and our relationships with each other, and the fact that things are very fractured. One of the things that I think is that the internet is designed in binaries. It operates in zeros and ones, and human beings are fractional. They don't exist in those binary spaces. Life is too weird and complicated and strange and revelatory and all of these amazing things for it to be parsed in that kind of binary way. And the more that we put people into right and left or black and white, we really start to set up and I think the film The Social Network said this actually very boldly, is that we set up the conditions for civil war, where certain groups of people start really hating on other groups of people. And really for no more reason other than that they're feeling anxious and afraid, and they're looking for a reason or a sort of set of a logic with which to explain those feelings.
And that has been incredibly corrosive on politics as well. I mean, you talk about how that has happened on the left and how those old-fashioned virtues that you and I might have been brought up with, like solidarity, begin to crumble and buckle under the desire to argue for purity, decide that people have to have one kind of politics and not another kind of politics, a sort of loss of tolerance. And I wanted you to talk about that a bit as well, the sort of call-out culture and what effect you think that that has.
I think it risks stifling creativity because it's made people very paranoid about what they can and can't say, and it suddenly made people very self-conscious. I think it's a double-edged sword because I think that there needs to be a kind of assertion from, you know, we need to speak about intersectionality. We need to speak about where we are oppressed. People clearly need the right to be able to say, well, hello, it's different for me over here. And that's one of the things I really like about the internet, is that it allows us to do that. But I think that once we get into the area of sort of really virulent, nasty call-out culture stuff, I think, well, actually, you're just behaving as badly as anybody on the right wing. And actually, Simone Weil has an interesting point about this. She says when the right and the left get too extreme, they meet each other on the way round. And I sort of feel like the kind of totalitarian sins are kind of being shown on both sides of the fence sometimes, that it is this will to dominate and suppress and get everybody to think the same as me. And I'm going to virulently call you out because you don't think the same way as me. And we lose our capacity to see each other as kind of complicated, interesting, difficult, contradictory people. And we lose this ability to trust each other on a very human level, I think. And I think that's the thing that worries me more than anything else, is that the consensus gets lost. And without that, it's very difficult to affect change, I think.
I want to just pull out for a minute. I'm interested in the process of you writing this book. You actually wrote it before the pandemic, but then did that experience of lockdown, experience of having to sort of migrate your social life, your emotional life online, change your feelings at all? Or did they harden your feelings? Did it seem you're like, damn, Julia, I got that right? Or did you change things?
No, I didn't really. I think I amplified some things in the book. I think to begin with, I thought this is going to make us even more dependent on the internet, because this is the only way we're going to be able to have a conversation with each other, which it did. But I think that the thing that I'm feeling quite strongly at the moment, certainly from some people, is a feeling that you know, the screen isn't enough. It's not enough, and that people are very lonely in lockdown, and that actually physical relationships, meeting people, speaking to people, being with other people really matters, that the screen is never going to compensate for that experience of sociability, of hanging out and physically being present with other people. And I think that's become clearer under the lockdown rather than less clear in a way.
I think that's true. I think there was a moment where it seemed like the internet is capable of saving us, and that quickly tarnished.
Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of the process of writing the book, I think it's something that I wanted to write about for ages. I sort of had it in the back of my mind as something that I wanted to think about. And then I think those essays were published, the Berkheim essay, and then the one about my Oxford interview, and they went viral. And the experience of coping with that was really quite insane. I suddenly realized that I'd actually sort of become this person that had a phone literally stitched to her hand the whole time. I was one of those zombies. I was walking into people on the street and not paying attention to what was going on around me. And I think my approach to the book really was to try and come at it from the ground level, which is I wanted to look at my own experience with it, and then from that use that as evidence for argument, but also bring in a lot of the other things that caught my eye. I mean, I did a lot of reading and a lot of research, and I sort of brought in, I hope, some of the stories from other countries and little bits of information in order to create a kind of collage. I think that's what I was trying to do with the book, technically, as a piece of writing, was to create this sort of collage effect across the whole book, which I hope would build up to an argument, but also give the reader enough space to start to think about their own experiences of working, you know, social media and the internet, what it's done to them, how it's changed the way that they think about things or approach things.
I think it's a very subtly argued book, because you walk along sort of, here's this anecdote, here's that anecdote, yes, I understand that, and you find yourself sort of brought into the argument so skillfully. I'm incredibly impressed by the deftness of it. So we are finding ourselves in this increasingly angry, paranoid, confused, addictive, incredibly fast-paced space. And something starts happening both to our internal reality and to the external reality. I'll quote you here. The effect on the meat space is increasingly strange and dystopic. Our lives get ever more circumscribed by the demands of capital. Can you talk a bit more about that, about what you mean by that?
Well, I think if the internet exists, at the moment, the platforms exist in order to make a profit, clearly. And because of that, I think that they're not neutral spaces at all. And that really what's happening in a sense is that a certain kind of capitalist thinking about that money has primacy over everything is infecting the way that we kind of relate and think and talk to each other on the internet, because money is at the bottom. It's the driving force behind all of these platforms. And I am the user, and I, therefore, am the product. And I think it's really hard for us to think about ourselves in those terms, because we think we go to the platform as a kind of in control of ourselves. We're going to this because we choose to do it. We're going to, but actually, I think we're not. I think we're being manipulated quite often into going and looking at and scrolling for, why am I doom scrolling? Why have I just spent what's happened to the last half an hour of my life? I lose time to this platform, and then I come away from it feeling dazed and strange. I did it all last week with the American elections. I wanted to know what was going to happen desperately. Shit, is he going to get out? What's going to happen to Donald Trump? And there I am, kind of stuck in this loop with information. What happened? Why can't I shut the computer, walk away from it, read a book, do something else? It becomes somehow the most important thing, becomes my connection to reality. And then what happens in the real world is that we have protests in London against lockdown. We have people on the streets saying that 5G masts are causing all kinds of problems. We have people saying that vaccinations are going to kill everybody. We have, and it's like, oh God, shit, suddenly this is turning everybody's head inside out. There's a sense of everything being very spongy. We've lost the sense that there's a reality that we can trust in. It's not there anymore. And I think that that's quite dangerous for the social fabric and for our sense of ourselves within society. It's difficult to know really where it is. Does the society exist in Silicon Valley, or does it exist in my neighborhood with my neighbors next door? It's very, and in America, you've got people who are neighbors voting for Trump and voting for Biden and not speaking to each other. This is what I think it's doing.
I think it used to feel so clearly like it was separate worlds. There was the world that you had inside the internet and you could close the lid, and then there was the world that you were in. And now it's like a portal's opened and the internet has poured out into the streets.
Yeah, exactly. It does feel like Pandora's box. And that the box has been opened and all of those things have flown out.
Dominic Cummings at the head. But that sort of very clear, tangible effect that it's had on our politics in England from the referendum point onwards. Can we talk about that a little bit? What are your feelings about that?
I think it would be interesting to look back at this time and see how much money was poured into advertising that was very, very specifically pinpointed at people who probably already had racist views, and they would know. The algorithm will know. I mean, of course, the internet hasn't made your Uncle Ben racist, but it will have discovered that those were his proclivities, and he will see more and more information that backs up that view, because there isn't any reason not to. And I want to know why Facebook didn't shut down QAnon 2 years ago. That conspiracy theory was allowed to run riot across the platforms for a long time, and then they closed it down, I think, in September, when they thought that Biden was going to win, because they think that there's some regulation coming, which I think is good. It should be. I think these are media platforms. They're not. I think the argument has always been that this is a reflection of society, but I think it's conditioning society too. The amplification, which I think is happening on such a global scale, is the thing that I think frightens me.
It's always towards outrage, that the opinions that would have been very, very extreme in a world governed by newspapers and news organizations on the internet have much more traction. I think you make very elegant arguments for that the most outrageous, what was the worth of Trump to Twitter? $2 billion. The thing that makes people angry makes people click, it makes people spend time, and we can all see the effect that that's had on the entire social world around us.
Yes, and it's made people very angry. And I think that sort of constant sense that outrage is also, and I also think that doom scrolling is also addictive, because people are addicted to the cortisol. There's a sort of feeling that runs through you when you're frightened. As cortisol runs through your body, and you're going to get more and more of that if you keep scrolling through these stories that are going to frighten you. It's the reason we watch horror films. We kind of like that sometimes, those to put ourselves in front of a screen and have those feelings kind of created in us or for us by art. But in this case, it's being created by the constant scroll of information, and I don't think we're aware of it.
Another truly alarming quote from you. A new kind of human behaviour then emerges under this influence, a semi-automated for-profit personality which is being constantly nudged and notified and prompted, which is always seeking attention, always available, often anxious, often angry, afraid, jealous, paranoid, unsure of what or who to believe. Julia, I don't want that to be our future. What do we do?
Good question. I mean, I think that we have to take control over when, I mean, I have a really big issue with Facebook, and I'm on the verge of deleting it, and I would delete it except for I have some great friends that I would miss, and I see their lives because through Facebook, we're very busy. They live on the other side of the world. There are things like that where I suppose I feel like I'd be losing too much if I was to quit it. But there's another part of me that just thinks actually this is turning into quite a right-wing organization. They're not really controlling the information that's on that website. Okay, I'm not seeing adverts for QAnon because I'm obviously not their target audience, but other people are saying all kinds of nonsense about Trump and Brexit and so on, and nobody's sort of controlling that. And I think we need to make a big fuss about that and ask a lot of loud questions about it. So regulation, I think, is one of them. But I think the other thing is just to be aware of how we're feeling when we pick up our phones. How am I feeling? Quite often, if I'm really conscious about it, when I reach for it, I'm reaching for it because I feel bored or anxious. It's never a positive feeling. I'm not going on there to look at something deliberately. I'm not directing my actions. And I think that's the thing that really struck me, was how much of my life am I actually in control of in relation to particularly my phone, maybe less so my computer. And of course, the thing that comes back to you always from libertarian capitalists is, if you're feeling anxious, go and do mindfulness meditation. We've got the answer for you. We'll fix this. The problem that we've created will help you to fix. But I sort of think it needs a deeper fix than that. It needs a kind of proper ethical intervention. We need to think about what we want this for. Why do we want all this information, and how are we going to use it?
Something that I was struck by is that you kept coming back to the body, that you kept coming back to the idea of us as real human bodies, and the idea that even though we might feel that we're escaping into this bodiless space, this space of sort of pure mind, pure freedom of movement, actually what's making us so addicted is our own biology, that we're hacked by our vulnerable biology, nice way of putting it. Does the body also have potential as a way out of this, though? Is there a possibility of returning to our bodies? I feel like that's something that you've touched on in your work a lot.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm writing this from a position of vulnerability. I think I feel vulnerable in relation to the internet. It's a hyper object, that thing that Timothy Morton says. It's too big for us almost to comprehend. It was a really difficult essay to write because it was like pulling handkerchiefs out of a pocket. It was a magician. There was one thing attached to another, to another, to another. It seems to touch so much of our experience of the world, and it's happened so fast, and it touches on so many different areas of our lives. It's almost impossible to squish it into 1,600, whatever it is, 16,000 words. It was difficult to parse in a way, but I think we have to, if we want to have a future in which information. It's Steve Jobs' thing. We want it to be a bicycle for the mind, and at the moment, I feel like it's a bit of a bulldozer.
Yeah, and then it has an illusion that you're going somewhere, but you're not actually going anywhere at all. That sense that you're engaging in activism by reading things that mean that you're actually just sitting stupefied in front of a screen.
Totally. Yeah, and I think to go back to that thing about the body, I think that there's another part of which I didn't have room to really go into, but there is some evidence that actually, sitting in front of our screens for a long time is bad for our bodies, and we're not actually listening to the signals from our bodies while we're sitting in front of the screen. We don't sit up or walk around or whatever. We're just sitting there slumped. It's actually affecting our postures. It's affecting the way that we walk, and it's affecting our physical selves. And we're not listening to that thing that says, "Oh, my back hurts. I need to stretch," because we're so enraptured in it. I mean, we walk in front of trains, we get run over, people die. So it's quite clear that it's incredibly physically engrossing, and the body is the thing that's getting left behind. And I guess I'm interested to think about how we can make space for the physical body, or make the case for the physical body.
We're gonna pull out audience questions in a minute, but I'm just going to ask one more question myself, which is, what we haven't touched on yet is the idea of radical attention. The idea, I think, your book frightened me a lot, but it also made me feel that there were possibilities for liberation, for a different way of being, and that was down to the ideas that it contains about different kinds of attention, ways of paying attention. So I just wanted to end by maybe talking about Simone Weil and what radical attention means to you.
I think for me it means creating very deliberately a space for creativity and for thought, and a very deliberate space for thought that's separate from information and reading information. It's about sort of creating that space, maybe in a classroom, with other people also. I think it's quite one of my, some of my most magical experiences have been in a classroom with a group of people where we're all sitting together thinking about something and discussing it and trying to come to terms with it, or find different angles or ways of thinking about something, and the way that the world can expand when you do that. And I suppose I'm trying to make a case for that kind of expansive thinking, rather than the sort of assertive thinking on the internet, which wants to have everything packaged up and have an answer for everything and have everything conclusively pinned down, which of course is impossible to do. And I suppose I'm also making a case for that sort of negative capability, which I think you need to have if you're going to be a good artist, which is that we don't have the answers for everything. Life is complicated and difficult, and that's okay. And I think starting from that point can quite often create all kinds of amazing pieces of work, because it liberates people from feeling like they have to create something, a persona or something that will, be the next hot take. They can actually explore and find out what they think. They don't have to know.
The liberation of saying, I don't know.
Exactly.
And then finding out, and then traveling into the finding out.
Yes, I think that often the internet expects us to know the answer before we've asked the question.
Okay, questions from outside of the two of us? Are there other questions to come?
There are lots. So thanks very much to everyone who has submitted a question in the comments. And apologies if I don't get to all of them. I'm going to do my best to kind of try and summarize what everyone's asked and kind of combine the questions together. And perhaps dodge the ones that were answered by Julia during the launch. But first, kind of picking up on what you were both just talking about, there are a couple of questions about education. One from Lou Mycroft, who's talking about her work in the thinking environment, which compels honesty, and who honestly wants to believe that we can counter the culture that you describe, but wonders whether you have any other strategies. And another question from Jacqueline Shreves-Lee, who wonders if you had any insights on how we can make our society more supportive of all young people, and framing that with attachment theory, which is something you talk about in the book. So, I mean, as an educator, are there, and I know there are no easy answers, unfortunately, but I wondered whether you had any responses to that.
I think I want to encourage people to think about their relationship with knowledge and information, and to be able to create a space in a classroom. I think that's, for me, the key thing when I'm teaching, is to create a space in a classroom where people can think. And that thinking is actually really difficult, because it involves kind of and that's what I'm trying to do by using Simone Weil and also Iris Murdoch, who both kind of think about attention as the sort of moment at which we're able to start to understand things. And for me as an educator, I'm working with attention. I'm trying to train people's attention. I'm trying to get them to obviously to look at the set text or the exercises that I've set or whatever. But that sort of collective concentration on solving problems is magic. That's really where interesting things can start to happen. And I really would love that for that to start to happen either through the internet or in groups. If we're going to solve the climate change issue, we're not going to solve it by yelling at each other on Twitter or on Facebook. It's just not going to happen. It's going to happen by meeting with people who are concerned to change things, and in real life, discussing these things, preparing young people to deal with some of these issues. And I think that my answer for Jacqueline would be, if we're going to help young people, it's really by giving them some of the skills they're going to need to navigate some of these difficult things they're going to have to deal with in the future. If education is anything, it's about a legacy. It's about leaving something behind. What do we want to leave for the next generation? Well, I don't want to leave them in the muddle of Twitter and Facebook and leave that to educate them. I think we have to sort of intervene and create spaces where they can talk about how they feel about some of these things too.
That's great. Thank you very much. So we've got a couple of other questions about so going from interventions on a kind of personal level to a more structural level about policy and the way that these companies are structured. So Jack Skelly says, in the US, Facebook is the single largest source of false conspiracies. Should it be much more tightly regulated by the government? And then we have a question from Alex Bond, who asks, do you believe that smartphones are inherently problematic, or is it the way that social media platforms have been designed with profit in mind? So I guess I just wondered whether you had any thoughts about how, on a structural level, societies might go about trying to think about controlling or marshalling these parallel realities into something that represents something that we recognise from before the split.
I mean, for me, I think it has to come down to an acknowledgement that they're media companies. That they actually have a responsibility for the things that they carry on those platforms in the same way that a newspaper would. For me, that seems a bit of a no-brainer, and I think they've managed to work their way out, around that in various different legalistic ways. And I think we also have to acknowledge that there's an enormous amount of lobbying money being spent trying to avoid these kinds of regulations because they're going to get in the way of the profit margins. So, I think there's a fight coming. I think there's going to be a lot of battles. And the other issue that's really problematic for us is that this isn't happening in our jurisdiction. This is happening in America. And we're being governed now by, and I think it's happening on a global scale, by a particular set of media and internet companies that are, affecting the whole planet, but they actually are in a very small corner of California, or Washington if it's Amazon, but it's Seattle. That I think is very problematic because we feel very helpless, I think, in relation to that. And I think that's why everyone's so obsessed with the American election as well. It's not mattered so much before in my lifetime who's been running the American government and I think Donald Trump is a really, really interesting figure who seems to me to have emerged from social media. He's like this horrible id figure shouting at everybody, terrifying everybody. We're still scared of him. We still think he might not give up the presidency. And he's trolling everybody all over the place on social media. It's very, very strange that our politics now is being played out on this platform too. All the rumors from Number 10 that have been coming out over the last couple of days, etc., etc. This shouldn't surely be how governments function, and I think that's why it needs regulating, as any other media organization would be regulated.
Thank you very much. We've got another great question from Daniel Shaw, which touches more specifically on two of the thinkers that you write about in the book. I'm just going to read it because it's well phrased. I loved your idea that attention requires a kind of self-distancing, but do you think that attention can ever be empty, as Vile says, or objective, as Murdoch says, or do we always bring something of ourselves?
No, I think we always bring something of ourselves. I don't think we're ever going to reach a position of objectivity, and I don't think that's really what Iris Murdoch means, because when she talks about it in The Sovereignty of Good, she says that the mental hospitals are full of people who think they've got the universal theory of everything, that they figured everything out. You know, the issue really is being able to sit with uncertainty. And I think we live in a time of incredible uncertainty about the future, and we don't know what's going to happen next. And the shadow of death passes over us every night with the coronavirus, and things are kind of dark and scary. And I think trying to find an answer for that on the internet is really going to send us on a hiding to QAnon and doom scrolling and sort of all kinds of strange answers, which probably aren't going to be very helpful. They're just going to make us feel more afraid. And in the end, they're passive. I think that's the other issue for me, is that it's a very passive way of dealing with this situation. Whereas for me, what Simone Veil's talking about in particularly in the notes that she has on attention, is that it's a very active form of looking. She's not talking about the passivity of somebody who's meditating. She's talking about the active act of thinking, of choosing what you think about and making space to consider and to ponder and not come to a conclusion, not necessarily have an answer. It might take time, and it's okay to say, I don't know. I don't know what I think about this. I'm going to go away and think about it.
That's great. I think I've just to kind of round off, there's a question from me. I think what I enjoyed so much about working on this book is, while you've identified a real problem in the way that we interact with one another, I do think it's an inherently hopeful book. And I wondered, we were talking before the event started about the US election, about what it's been like for this book to come out in that context. And I wondered if you felt any grounds for hope for the
yes,
or anything that's changed since you finished working on the book.
I do feel a bit more hopeful, in the sense that I think hopefully America's reached a point where Trump can't try to pull a coup, but he is trying. And I think we need to be very, 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 very real about that fact. And I also think that the same thing has happened in the UK. I think the interesting thing, and I think that this is what coronavirus revealed, is that strong men can't deal with a crisis. They're very good at running around and using social media to shout and frighten people and, you know, say that they've got the answers to everything. But actually, when a coronavirus pandemic struck, they were completely incapable of managing it. They didn't know how to pull together society or to get people to come together to solve a problem. They just couldn't do it. And I think they've been revealed as being kind of naked at the party, really. I think we've got to live with it for a bit longer than possibly America, because we've got another 4 years of the Brexiteers to deal with. But I definitely feel very strongly that whole, you know, sort of 2015 onwards, really, that there were a lot of people who had paid money with vested interest in disrupting the social environment, making us feel confused and angry, either switched off or turned into some kind of conspiracy theories. Because if we're not engaged, then we're not going to change the status quo. We're not going to fix anything. We're not going to change anything. And I think my question really is, how can we change things? How can we make the space for change? And I think that really has to be us coming together and paying attention, and not just sort of sitting in front of social media screaming, oh, it's all too awful. I don't know what Olivia thinks about that.
I agree. Leave Facebook. Julia, now's the time. Leave it.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to. I don't feel that I can. I feel that it's too.
Finish the event. Everyone has to delete their Facebook accounts. I do feel like all of the kind of bonds that you describe as being eroded by the structures that you also describe in the book have been the things that have supported us over the last 6 months. The kind of those underlying ties that have helped us get through the pandemic crisis, and which are kind of showing that a disinformation campaign in the US can't steal the election. So I feel, I also feel hopeful.
Yeah, and I also think your bookshop is a site of great hope. It's such a nice, you know, bookshops in and of themselves, but also your bookshop particularly. It's just nice to be able to go to a space where there are books and ideas and people, and you can sit there and talk and think about things. And I'm hoping, you know, as soon as we're all out of this situation, I'm looking forward to being able to come back and doing things in real life.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've certainly missed that. well, we'll have plenty of opportunities. Well, from the middle of that next year, it looks like we'll have to have a second launch. Do it on this date next year. Well, I think that's probably a good time to round off. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to Olivia for such brilliant questions, and to Julia, of course, for writing the book. Anyone who's watching who hasn't bought it, you know, I'm a bookseller, so I've got to say it. It's available on our website, Burley Fisher's website, and also on Peninsula's website. I'm going to be sending out a list of books, but Olivia's books as well, on the emails that I sent out with the links before the event tomorrow. So, yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.